In her review of Julia Whitty's book, The Fragile Edge, Pam Houston writes, author and filmmaker Julia Whitty will make even the most landlocked among us feel that we have been privy to the mystery and wonder of the undersea world. The Fragile Edge won a host of awards, including the PEN USA Literary Award and the John Burroughs Medal. And it was a favorite among the MFA students here at Iowa State last semester in our travel writing class. Her short story collection, A Tortoise for the Queen of Tonga, won an O. Henry Award and was a finalist for the PEN Hemingway Award. Deep Blue Home, An Intimate Ecology of Our Wild Ocean is her latest book. She is the environmental correspondent for Mother Jones, and she blogs at Deep Blue Home. Quoting Houston again, the product of a scientist's mind, a sociologist's eye, a Zen Buddhist's soul, and a poet's heart, her work is at once a natural history, a call to action, a love song, and a prayer. Please join me in welcoming Julia Whitty.
Well, thank you, Audrey, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Iowa State University, for inviting me here this evening and getting to talk about the ocean. It's an honor to come to a place where, if I have my geology right, there used to be an ocean here. That we are standing on what was once seafloor. So this is how much the world changes. Jonathan Swift said, "Vision is the art of seeing things invisible. Sometimes the invisible is a huge, dominant, virtually omnipotent presence in our world, the feature for which our planet should have been named and may well be named by distant, intelligent beings with the means to see further than we can at present. The ocean is our blind spot, a deep, dark, distant, and complex realm covering nearly 71% of Earth's surface. We have better maps of Mars than of our own seafloor. Yet under our skin, we are a plasma ocean, so entwined with the outer seas that we can't easily know either ourselves or our water world. This ocean is Earth's largest wilderness, home to wildlife in staggering multi-species aggregations, and with a lineage of life 3 billion years older than anything above sea level. Its three-dimensional realm, most of it in utter darkness, comprises 99% of all habitable space on our planet and is so embedded with life as to be largely composed of life. An ounce of seawater is home to as many as 30 billion microorganisms and counting. Honing our technological eyesight, we begin to observe what was once too small to be seen in an exercise that mirrors infinity. Tonight we're going to think about the future of the ocean. I refer to it as one ocean because science teaches us that all the bodies of water we call the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Arctic, and Southern oceans are one. They are connected by a great ocean conveyor to form the world ocean, such that a drop of rain falling in the North Atlantic travels this ocean conveyor on both surface and deep water currents, circling Antarctica to emerge in the North Pacific a millennium or more later. This connectedness gives the ocean resilience and strength. For instance, there's geologic evidence that the saltiness of the ocean, which averages 35 parts per thousand of salinity, has been the way it is for at least 1 billion years. Despite massive swings in climate and biodiversity, the saltiness of the ocean endures. There's not a whole lot in our world that's proven as stable as that. But the connectedness of the world ocean also makes it fragile. Until recently, we thought we could throw stuff in it without consequence. Off the coast of San Francisco, near where I live, More than 47,000 drums of low-level radioactive waste were dumped onto the sea floor between 1946 and 1970. Many of these were scattered across what is now the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, a place of biological importance. Unfortunately, for the 36 species of marine mammals that feed in these waters, and for the 300,000 seabirds that breed on the Farallon Islands, many of those drums of radioactive waste are now corroded and leaking. We dumped this stuff in there because we thought the ocean was infinite. That idea was a byproduct of a lack of vision and a lack of knowledge. After all, the ocean seems huge. We like to stand on the shore and stare at its boundless horizon. We take comfort in its mystery and its unknowingness. As Rachel Carson wrote in her first published piece, Undersea, who has known the ocean? Neither you nor I, with our earthbound senses, know the foam and surge of the tide that beats over the crab hiding under the seaweed of his tide pool home. By the second half of the 20th century, the infinitude of the ocean began to be challenged. We used to think we could take whatever we wanted out of the ocean without consequence, until we saw global fish catches stabilizing, even declining. This despite better technologies and increasing man-hours fishing at sea. For the first time, we began to imagine a different ocean, one where fish might face extinction. This was a tough conceptual leap. For most of human history, no one imagined extinction. In 1796, French zoologist Georges Cuvier presented a seminal paper to the National Institute of Sciences and Arts in Paris, describing the differences between fossil mammoth bones and modern elephant bones. His work proved for the first time the existence of a world previous to ours, destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. Once the idea of extinction took root in our imaginations, we began to see that species could go extinct in our own time and at our own hand. Take the well-known case of the passenger pigeon, once among the most numerous animals in existence. A single flock that passed over southern Ontario in 1866 was 1 mile wide and 300 miles long. It took 14 hours to pass and contained an estimated 3.5 billion birds. That strategy of flocking in such enormous numbers gave passenger pigeons huge biological success in the wild woodlands of North America. But it also made them extremely vulnerable to a predator with the ability to shoot them out of the sky, and a predator who could not conceive that such abundance could be obliterated. Massachusetts even passed a law in 1848 protecting the people who netted wild pigeons, with $10 fines imposed on anyone who damaged nets or frightened pigeons away from the nets, which implies that someone was beginning to suspect that this practice might not be sustainable. How bad was it? In 1869, one town in Michigan shipped 3 train car loads full of dead passenger pigeons to market every day for 40 days for a total of 11.8 million birds. Passenger pigeons were also vulnerable to a predator with the ability to clear-cut their woods and destroy their food sources, beechnuts, acorns, chestnuts, seeds, and berries. The last confirmed sighting of a passenger pigeon in the wild was in 1900, and the species was declared extinct in 1914 when this pigeon, Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. The great naturalist and writer Aldo Leopold lamented the vanished passenger pigeon in an observance held in Wisconsin in 1947, and he said, "Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live who in their youth were shaken by their living wind. But a decade hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know." Nowadays, we have no trouble imagining the sad end of the passenger pigeon. And some of us are even imagining the possibility of cloning this species and other extinct species back into existence. But the last sardine? Can we imagine that a fish swimming in an aquarium someday might be the last of its kind on Earth and in the near future? We're ramping up large-scale hunting of forage fish, sardines, and anchovies, species that form the ecological backbone of many marine food webs. As we've learned the hard way from fisheries off California, Peru, Japan, and Namibia, forage fish populations collapse catastrophically whenever the stresses of a changing climate intersect with the stresses of overfishing. Forage fish flock in enormous schools, just like passenger pigeons. The Pacific sardines that live off my coast range as far north as Alaska, in shoals comprising what may once have been the biggest entities ever to live in the ocean. They migrate north in the summer and south in the fall, in groups segregated by birth year. Each size class roams farther each year as the fish age over the course of natural lifespans of 25 years or more. Like passenger pigeons, their strategy of gathering in huge numbers gives them enormous biological success until they encounter a predator that can decimate their schools, and until they meet a predator who can clear-cut their food supply. In this case, the food of forage fish are the ocean's primary consumers, planktonic crustaceans like krill. 1 or 5 trophic links removed, krill and their like feed almost everything else that lives in or makes its living from the ocean, including us. Most of the krill we catch is processed into fish food for aquariums and aquaculture ponds. Some is used to make the flesh of farmed salmon turn pink, a more attractive color for sale. Some is used as bait for sport fishing, and some is used for omega-3 supplements. The growth of industrial-scale krill fisheries isn't the only problem for sardines and other forage fish. We're also catching the ocean's apex predators, tuna, sharks, and billfish, the marine equivalent of wolves, mountain lions, and grizzlies. Why is that a problem for sardines? Because we know that ecosystems benefit from the presence of both predators and competitors, that the removal of either or both destabilizes the remaining species, reducing biodiversity. This was one of the great revelations of 20th century science. And in this case, vision is also the science of seeing things invisible. Because of our developing scientific vision, we know that life cycles in the sea are more complex than many life cycles on the land. Species that spend their adulthood adrift, like jellyfish, spend their youth anchored to the seafloor, while species that spend their adulthood anchored to the seafloor, like corals, oysters, and sponges, spend their youth adrift. Even large swimming species like swordfish and tuna spend their youth as larvae, no bigger than fingernail clippings afloat on currents. This strategy of marine life magnifies our impacts in frightening ways. We hunt the adults in one part of the ocean and destroy the nursery grounds of their larvae in another, and poison the habitat of their juveniles somewhere else, while depleting the species they depend on for food at each stage. Consider the Atlantic bluefin tuna, an endangered species. Pollutants inflict an insidious, often invisible toll. In 2010, the spawning of bluefin tuna converged in time and space with the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf is one of only 2 known breeding areas for this species. We don't know the effects of 206 million gallons of oil and almost 2 million gallons of chemical dispersant on adult fish that came to spawn that year, or the next year, or will come in the future. We don't know the outcome of unprecedented levels of pollution on delicate eggs and larvae, and therefore on entire generations of an endangered species. We may not know for years, decades, or ever. Even in a good year or a good decade, spawning tuna in the Gulf of Mexico are affected by the presence of 36,000 miles of offshore pipeline and 52,000 offshore wells. Thousands of these rigs are left abandoned and untended, many still leaking. Add to that the other ongoing calamities in the Gulf of Mexico, the disappearing wetlands, the channelization of the Mississippi River. Consider the massive dead zone that forms every spring and summer in the Gulf. It's the second largest dead zone on the globe, a place where almost no marine life can live. It's caused by runoff from America's breadbasket, the farms, feedlots, and ranches along the entire Mississippi River watershed, all of which eventually flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Here's how it works. 1, runoff from farms also fertilizes the ocean. 2, the fertilized ocean causes huge blooms of tiny oceanic plants, known as phytoplankton. 3, when these blooms grow bigger than predators can eat them down, the phytoplankton die and fall en masse to the bottom. 4, those dead phytoplankton fuel huge blooms of detritivores. Those are the microorganisms that feed on dead things. Those microorganisms then breathe up almost all the available oxygen in the water. 5, the ocean is left hypoxic or a dead zone where almost nothing can live. Marine life that can't swim or crawl away fast enough or at all dies. Globally, dead zones are doubling in size and number every decade. The sad truth is that most of what undermines the Gulf of Mexico and all the other hot spots on that map has been done with little or no considerations of its waters and wildlife. And that's in marked contrast to our developing attitudes towards the land, where increasingly we are weighing the value of ecosystems and the services they provide in our decision-making process. And these aren't minor services that ecosystems provide. As you can see from the list, we're talking the essentials like food, energy, and climate regulation. And at the end of the list, we have the less tangible but equally important services like inspiration and scientific discovery. Yet we've barely begun to assess the ecosystem services provided by the ocean when we make decisions about how to use the ocean. We almost never examine the effects of our growing action on the waters offshore, or the deep ocean, or the seafloor. In this, the battered Gulf of Mexico is a microcosm of the entire ocean. And it's not just about the future of tuna or sardines or krill. 1 billion people on Earth depend on food from the sea as their primary source of protein. The global average consumption is 37 pounds per person per year of seafood. Global production of fish products is far greater than global production of poultry, beef, or pork. Yet some 32% of the world's fish stocks are estimated to be overexploited, depleted, or recovering, and need urgently to be rebuilt. So back to the Atlantic bluefin tuna, whose presence in the ocean improves the prospects for forage fish, whose presence improves the prospects for krill, whose presence makes so much of our food possible. It's estimated that bluefin tuna have declined by as much as 51% in the Atlantic in only 3 tuna generations. It's the result of a combination of poor fishing practices, including overfishing, illegal fishing, fishing on spawning schools, which is like eating your seed corn, and using outdated or flawed data to set catch limits. Plus, there are many unregulated sports fisheries on juvenile fish, combined with the fact that more and more young fish are being caught in the wild to raise to adulthood on tuna farms, which means they never spawn because we don't yet know how to get tuna to spawn in captivity. And then there are all the other factors we know are affecting the ocean, though we don't know their specific effects on tuna and most other marine life, including the increasing amounts of plastic in the sea. We don't know how that might be affecting the larvae of tuna and other animals that dwell among zooplankton communities in warm surface waters. Many of these zooplankton communities concentrate in the mid-ocean gyres, big circles, eddies of water formed by prevailing currents and winds. Unfortunately, these gyres are now rife with trapped plastic debris that breaks down at sea into tiny pieces that look a lot like plankton, which are eaten and passed up the food web starting with zooplankton, including the larvae of fish like tuna. I call this the other oil problem, since most plastics are made from oil. It's one of the biggest threats to the future of the ocean and all who live in it or depend on it. How bad is that problem? We make 127 million tons of plastic every year. 10% of all that plastic wends its way to sea. Of that, 20% is tossed off ships or oil rigs, and the remaining 80% arrives via floods and sewage outflows. Here in the US, we make a record-setting 240 pounds of plastic per person per year. Unfortunately, a lot of marine animals mistake plastic in all its forms for food. Plastic debris is fed by seabirds, like this Laysan albatross to their chicks. Almost every Laysan albatross on Earth nests in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, smack in the middle of a plastic gyre. And 97.5% of the albatross chicks raised here have plastic in their guts that was fed to them by their parents. Ordinarily, these birds are extremely long-lived. You might have heard of Wisdom, a 62-year-old female Laysan albatross who is still laying eggs and hatching chicks. She's the oldest known wild bird in the United States. And last month, she hatched this little beauty. Unfortunately, 40% of the Laysan albatross chicks in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands die from plastic fed to them by their parents before they reach the age when they can regurgitate non-food items. Worldwide, some 2 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals and sea turtles die from eating plastic every year. We used to think plastic didn't degrade at all, just broke into ever smaller pieces in the ocean, but recent research shows that plastics decompose with surprising speed, and in the process, they release toxins and carcinogens into the water. Not good for tuna and other living things. Yet another threat to the future of the ocean stems from a radical change in the population of phytoplankton, the microscopic plants of the sea. These are the ocean's primary producers that kickstart life. They perform on a global scale what we can't even manage on a village scale, namely turning sunlight into energy. They are the keystone players not just of the ocean, but of all the planet. Through the processes of photosynthesis, they make half the oxygen we breathe and mitigate 1/3 of the carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere. And they support virtually all life on Earth. But according to one recent study, phytoplankton have declined worldwide an average of 1% a year since 1950, for a staggering total of a 40% decline. If nearly half of all wild and cropped plants disappeared from the terrestrial world, all animals, including humans, would decline. The demise of phytoplankton is thought to stem from a different kind of pollution. Rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases produce a warming and more stratified ocean, which means there's less mixing between the layers and less stirring up of nutrients from the bottom to support phytoplankton on the surface. In a real sense, the ocean begins to petrify and phytoplankton to starve. A warming ocean also threatens to reroute the travels of drifting species, including big animals in their larval stages. Changes in global temperature send more rain and meltwater into some parts of the ocean, changing the saltiness of seawater and therefore its density, and potentially changing the force and direction of the powerful ocean conveyor. Because the conveyor carries heat away from the equatorial waters to the high latitudes, a warmer, less salty ocean threatens to further disrupt one of our most critical climate regulators. And as bad as that seems, warming isn't the biggest threat to the ocean from our greenhouse gas emissions. The worst problem stems from a flip side to climate change, what's sometimes called the other CO2 problem, ocean acidification. As carbon dioxide rises in the atmosphere, a third of it is taken up by the ocean, unleashing a complex series of chemical reactions that change the pH of seawater to make it more acidic. Since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the world ocean has become 30% more acidic. To the best of our knowledge, that is the fastest rate of acidification our planet has ever experienced. Today's acidified waters have reduced the concentration of carbonate ions in seawater by 16%. Carbonate ions are needed for many species of marine life to make their shelters, their reefs, shells, even skeletons, which means that rising acidity threatens the survival of entire ecosystems, starting with microscopic phytoplankton, because many of these tiny ocean plants make calcium carbonate shells. All the corals and calcifying algae that build coral reefs need carbonate ions. All Antarctic ecosystems are built upon sea urchins and other invertebrates that need carbonate ions. All Arctic ecosystems are built upon calcifying invertebrates on the seafloor, which need carbonate ions. Many food webs in the open ocean are built on tiny mobile species known as pteropods or sea butterflies, swimming snails that flap through open waters and are important fuel for many marine species important to people like salmon and tuna. Experiments in the lab proved that pteropods are highly susceptible to acidity levels expected in the ocean by the year 2050. Within 45 days of exposure, their shells dissolved. Far more alarming, however, researchers near Antarctica recently reported finding sea butterflies alive but suffering severe shell damage in waters that have rapidly acidified. This is a severely corroded shell collected from a pteropod near Antarctica. Meanwhile, half a world away, oyster hatcheries on the Oregon coast failed to produce any baby oysters last year, and not for the first time in this century. These hatcheries produce the seed oysters for most West Coast oyster farms. The problem is acidic waters at a critical stage in the oyster's development during the first 24 hours of life, when the fertilized eggs develop into swimming larvae and begin to build their first shells. In 2007, researchers found acidic waters off the Pacific Northwest that had already reached levels not expected until the year 2050. Worse, the acid in these waters is likely 50 years old and is just now being brought to the surface by increased upwelling associated with stronger winds and climate change, which suggests that ocean acidification will increase in a delayed response to increasing levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. As one marine ecologist put it, the coastal ocean acidification train has left the station and there's not much we can do to derail it. This won't be good for Penny the phytoplankton, Edward the sardine, Harriet the tuna, Wisdom the albatross, and everything else and everyone else. Acidification may have been one of the primary kill mechanisms behind a mass extinction 252 million years ago, long before the dinosaur die-off, when nearly all life on Earth disappeared. Some 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species disappeared. We call this extinction event the Great Dying, and recovery from it took an astonishing 30 million years and required a near-total reboot of life. So we're not close to that level of catastrophe today. But if you add up the troubles facing the ocean, the future does start to look kind of forbidding. So what can we do? Well, we want vision, right? We want to envision and enact a better future. So we can jump on that wonderful vessel that plays such a prominent role in the title of this symposium, imagination. And first up, let's give ourselves some credit for where our imagination has already brought us. We discovered the phenomenon of extinction. And based on that realization, we began the ongoing work of setting aside areas of Earth to preserve in recognition of their ecosystem services. That work began only 165 years ago, only an eye blink in the human lifespan on the planet, when George Perkins Marsh, a congressman from Vermont, bore witness to the loss of eastern forests and suggested we ought to conserve them. That was a truly revolutionary idea in his culture and his time. In his words, man who even now finds scarce breathing room on this vast globe cannot retire from the old world to some undiscovered continent and wait for the slow action of such causes to replace by a new creation the Eden he has wasted. Marsh's writings helped launch the modern conservation movement and helped launch the Adirondack Park, today the largest publicly protected landscape in the contiguous U.S., encompassing more than 6 million acres, bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Glacier, and Great Smoky Mountains national parks combined. Marsh's idea of protecting forests came on the heels of almost total deforestation in the East, and only months before unbridled gold fever would level California's wildlands. In Marsh's time, the notion of protecting nature was almost heresy. Yet since his proposal, we have really, with radical speed, rearranged our relationship to more than 160,000 landscapes to preserve 14% of terrestrial Earth. And we are beginning the process and have created now nearly 7,000 marine protected areas, sheltering about 1% of the planet's ocean. We've enacted sweeping legislation to conserve flora and fauna in most nations and even across tricky international borders. We are in the process of abandoning the notion of infinite resources and are beginning to redirect our human story toward the idea of sustainability. So while the dominant meme sees only our destruction of nature, a keystone idea might be that we're actually in the middle of a new process whereby nature is tweaking the design specs on its most ingenious piece of evolutionary engineering, human understanding. So I'd like to give you another example of how one person's vision and action have made a difference. I'm going to read you a short excerpt from one of my Mother Jones pieces called The Power of One. It's based on a trip I made back to Rasa Island in Mexico's Sea of Cortez in 2011 to follow up with my friend Enriqueta Velarde, a biologist who's been working on Rasa for 35 years. In 1980, I spent a field season with her there. I guess I'm supposed to still be going through slides. The island was protected, but there were so many problems facing the two species of seabirds who nest entirely on this island, or virtually entirely, Hermann's gulls and elegant terns, that back then I was not optimistic for the survival of these species. Yet Enriqueta's presence, her vision, and her action changed all that. So here's a brief excerpt. Enriqueta still moves across the island in the slow-motion style I remember, treading between one gull nest and another, foot poised in the air as she examines where to plant it to avoid stepping on birds and eggs and chicks that perfectly mimic the ground splattered with guano in all its wet and dry incarnations. But Hermann's gulls nest on virtually every square inch of Rasa Island, and even our careful footfalls violate the territorial integrity of one bird after another, so that we trigger a cascade of incensed nesters who burst into the air and scream past our heads, firing globby rains of guano upon us. A few slap us with webbed feet or smack us with their bills. We're headed to the tern colony in one of the largest of the island's 11 small valleys. Compared with the dull roar of the gulls, the colony of elegant terns, this place where 95% of the species nests, sounds like a jet-fueled apocalypse slipping off a million broken flywheels, so shrill and piercing it's a physical assault. Long before we can see these birds, we can hear them. But when we try to climb the old path to the Tern Valley we routinely walked in 1980, we're stopped by thousands of terns nesting on the ridge, a rocky place they never utilized back then. So we backtrack and try to cross in a different place, only to be stymied by more nesting terns. When we finally find a route, we come face to face with a sight I could never have imagined in 1980. Where once there was a small amoeba of a colony of terns, today there are multiple gargantuan superorganisms of colonies usurping nearly the entire valley. Does it look like more terns than you remember? Enriqueta shouts above the mayhem. She estimates there are some 200,000 terns now, 7 times the 1980 number. A multitude of factors have allowed these birds to buck the trend of dismally declining wildlife in our time, and each traces its genesis back to this small, now gray-haired woman before me. It took me years to see that Enriqueta Velarde was part of a widely and thinly dispersed bunch of like-minded misfits, frequently women who travel to Earth's last hinterlands and guard their wilderness nests with near-mythical ferocity. I met the matriarch of this clan, Jane Goodall, in Gombe Stream on the 25th anniversary of her work with wild chimpanzees. From Goodall, I learned the power of one. Alone, she had managed to preserve Gombe's postage stamp of verdancy amid a combat zone of stripped forests and eroding hillsides, unable to support either people or chimpanzees. In ecology speak, a keystone species is one with a disproportionate effect on its environment relative to its biomass. In Jane Goodall, I realized I had met a keystone individual. Over time, I met other keystone humans stubbornly attached to remote rainforests, wetlands, mountains, deserts, and coral reefs, influencing those areas far beyond their mortal size. A few had attracted enough National Geographic coverage to become household names, though most accepted obscurity as a prerequisite of isolation. Yet their unknown stories of quest, conflict, discovery, and understanding are important to us, resuscitative sagas in a demoralizing age. So I hope you'll all read the article about my friend and some of the other extraordinary people. And if you think, well, that's just not enough, even these courageous and dedicated people can't go up against the massive forces working against sustainability in our world and in our ocean, well, then I'd like to mention my latest cover article for Mother Jones called Full Green Ahead. This could be the topic of a whole nother lecture, but in a nutshell, it's the story of how the U.S. Navy is pioneering in energy transformation, reducing its dependence on foreign oil and dirty oil, phasing in biofuels for its ships and aircraft, growing clean energy from wind, wave, and solar power on its naval bases, and a host of other initiatives aimed at their ambitious goal of cutting their fossil fuel use in half by the year 2020, and they're on target. They're flying fighter jets with algae grown in seawater and powering a carrier strike group with biofuel made from camelina seed oil. This is the 4th time the United States Navy has ushered in an energy revolution that brought the whole world along in its wake. Just as it will today, commercial shipping burns the foulest of fuels. It's the 6th biggest nation of carbon dioxide emitters on the earth, commercial shipping. No industry wants cheaper and more stably priced fuel supply than commercial shipping and the commercial airlines, both of which are following the Navy's lead, ready to spring on their chosen choice of alternative fuels. The Navy is doing this in the name of readiness and security, but they also know today that our national security is intensely a matter of climate security and environmental security. It's one of the more hopeful stories I've reported, and I hope you'll read it. And I got to make a carrier landing aboard the USS Nimitz, a tailhook landing, and a catapult takeoff. And it was absolutely one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life. Finally, I would like to remind everyone that for every unit of effort we humans put into repairing, healing, and reviving the ocean and our natural world, nature rewards us 1,000-fold, 1,000,000-fold, with its phenomenal resilience and its deep, deep strength. Thank you. So I think we're going to segue into a Q&A with Tegan.
Hi, my name is Tegan Swanson. I'm a second-year MFA student here. And on behalf of everyone in our program and everyone here in Ames, I just want to thank Julia again for coming, as well as our other guests. Sherwin Bitsui is over there, and Elizabeth Bradfield, I believe, is still here, maybe? Oh, she's back there. So this is always one of the highlights of our year here, because as writers and lovers of the environment and environmental issues, we really love it when people come here and tell us their stories. So thank you again for coming. This is a Q&A session for everyone here. I have a million questions spinning through my brain right now, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. So I have a few, but I would like to open it initially to the room, and we can start. If you'll speak up, I will repeat the question afterward so that everyone can hear it, and then I will hear Julia's response.
We'll give a few seconds for the students to file out.
Yeah.
Okay, are you having trouble seeing over on that side?
We could push the table forward a little.
Maybe you want to just shift down.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think
We could share one mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have your hand up?
How can you protect the ocean when nobody owns it, like as far as sovereign, nation?
So the question is, how can you protect the ocean when it's no one owns it? And nations actually claim a large percentage of it, and so that is an interesting question. It brings up the whole law of the commons, which is a big thing with the ocean. Is how do you manage that? In a lot of cases, there are issues now around what's happening. Really, is nations have either protected their own territorial waters, and they do. We have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone off our coast, so we get that's a lot of ocean if you add it up. But what typically has happened is a lot of countries move out into the unregulated waters. So it's one of the things that we're challenged by as a species, but are beginning to address, is how do we manage these waters in the middle of these oceans that they don't fall into the economic zone. And we are working on treaties and things. It's really testing our ability to sort of work across those boundaries and those borders, but it's starting to happen. And that Atlantic bluefin tuna that I spent a lot of time talking about, that's one of the more interesting cases because it's really testing that. There are so many nations involved. The catch of that is so insanely valuable. Single fish have sold in the Tokyo market for $250,000. It's crazy money. And so people realize we're switching to that thing of, well, we don't just fish it out till it's all gone. Let's fish it out so that it's here forever. And that's changing slowly but surely.
I was wondering, you mentioned briefly at the end of your presentation about wind and wave energy. And wave energy is still in development, and it has its pluses and minuses. And I was curious if you had looked into that at all, and what your opinion is on wave energy, because there are a lot of environmentalists that are not for it because of some of the impacts it can have on coastal areas.
Well, I think it's going to be kind of like wind turbines. You know, we have to develop a turbine that is sensitive to. So we're learning how to develop wind turbines now. We're beginning to look into the fact that wind turbines take a really giant toll on birds and even worse on bats. So bats are killed not even by coming into contact with the turbine blades, but by the concussive force of the change in air pressure. They're such delicate animals. So we're starting to look at those. We're ahead of our thinking, as always, on the land. But there are some designs coming out for wave turbine things that potentially look promising. So I think, again, it's a matter of having that vision and having the knowledge as we go forward to carefully plan how we work this. And there's another form of energy from the ocean that's very much in a developmental stage, but that's pretty exciting if it can scale up, called ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC. And that's the thing where you're kind of working on the temperature differential between the deep ocean and the surface waters. And it's still very much being done on a pilot sort of level, but the Navy's putting money into that. They're very interested in that because you could potentially fuel your ships at sea by kind of trailing something into the deep. So that's a pretty tantalizing idea.
You mentioned the Navy's conversion to kind of using green fuel, which is very exciting. Whenever I hear about that, though, and maybe this is a bit of my distrust, I always wonder, like, are they like wholesale committed to doing this in a sustainable way, or is it kind of something where they're putting a stamp on it? But it sounds like from your presentation, it seems like they're getting a real go at it. So have you found that like they are kind of like thinking of it seriously? And if so, have you noticed are there any disadvantages, kind of things maybe they could be doing better?
Well, I was actually very impressed. I had the opportunity to go to the Pentagon, and I interviewed a variety of admirals and other people, and I was really impressed with the fact that they have this historical legacy of changing their energy paradigm, and that they know they bring the whole world along with them, and they have a sense of responsibility about it. And the other thing about the Navy, I mean, the Navy is filled with people who sail the ocean. So they employ and train a lot of oceanographers and a lot of meteorologists, and there's a lot of geeks. There's a lot of geekiness in that operation, which is great, and they are aware that they don't want to trade one problem for another. I was told this over and over again by the admirals, that we don't want to trade a foreign fuel for another foreign fuel. Whatever we grow, we want to grow it here. We don't want to create food shortages. It's not in our best interest, to grow fuel and leave people hungry. That destabilizes the world, and that's a problem we're then going to have to go fix. So they were very aware of irrigation issues. They said, we do not want to create, and they were specifically looking for things that were not going to take more irrigation, and they have a mandate that they cannot be using anything with a big fossil fuel footprint. So they're really looking at this thing, and they have been scaling up the growing of these types of things. And I honestly think they're going to make it happen. When I reported this story, which was mostly last spring and summer, they managed to get through a monster hurdle that Congress threw at them. And honestly, due to the vision of Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, who just did a historic, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway, and it worked. It worked. And the next Congress, they were refunded, and the program is going ahead. Now, even with the sequester, I was told that by the oceanographer of the Navy and by the head of this task force energy program, that this is their number one or number two priority in whatever funding they get, is to make this change. So
Iowa is a large farming state, and so we have a large contribution to the dead zone. What are some things people in Iowa can do, or farmers, or is there anything that's going on, or legislation or anything like that for restriction of use of chemicals?
there is a lot that Iowa can do, and that was one reason I spent a little bit of time talking about it. The woman I've worked with multiple times, her name is Nancy Rabelais, and she runs a thing called the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium. She's kind of the number one expert on the dead zone, and she's spent a lot of time looking at what could these farming states do and analyzing. And in the end, it really boiled down to the simplest and most cost-effective thing was to limit, not even end, wintertime fertilization. So, I mean, I can direct you at some point if you want to email me about the study that she reported all these findings in. The hard part, it's a little bit like what the guy sitting next to you asked, it's a sort of a tragedy of the commons. I mean, how do you get Iowa to care about what's happening off the coast of Louisiana? So then, where do you legislate this? At what point do you come in? And so it's moving, I know, a lot slower than she would like to see it move. And so it's one reason I'm always happy when I can come and talk in the breadbasket, because I feel like so much could be changed here with just a growing awareness, as we get to see our downstream effects. Good question.
Melissa?
So we know from your writing that you're a scuba diver, and I think something about that experience of being in close contact with nature inspires wonder and inspires care, but it's also quite complex because often that's being in contact with nature is a position of privilege, and often it brings along with it damage that we inflict accidentally. So I was just wondering what you think about the need to have experience with nature and what role that plays in solving this problem.
That's a good question, too. I'm always interested. I like sometimes to talk to people who've grown up in urban areas, and they have had experience with nature always, if you ask them. So in their childhood, they would have had a tree on their block who they became intimately familiar with when its leaves fell and when caterpillars were climbing up it and how its shadow moved from one season to the next across the sidewalk. We all have experience with nature. So nature doesn't live in preserves. It's everywhere. And we are all over it all the time. And we are part of it. We are not nature. We are also nature. So how can we live apart from nature? We can't. We are nature, in nature. It's all the same thing. So that whole question to me is almost approaching it from the wrong direction. Not that there aren't awarenesses we can have about places where there's less of a human footprint. But I don't believe... I think there are ways we can experience nature with minimal impact, and all it takes is for us to think about that. Just think about it, figure it out, make those choices, do it. And I would hope, that I don't like excluding people from nature, because I think our biggest problem in this day and age is growing a little too distant from it in our computer world. So anyway, a little bit garbled answer there, but.
Joe, you had a question?
Read briefly about farming seaweed.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that at all?
I don't, for energy, I'm not actually familiar with that, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, giant kelp, which grows off my coast, is, I think, considered the fastest growing plant on Earth. I think it can grow about 18 inches a day. Yeah. So it's crazy fast stuff, and, I wouldn't be surprised. However, kelp forests are fragile places, they're also a very fragile environment. So, but, we can't have energy for free. None of it's going to be for free, and we have to weigh the costs and benefits. That's basically the task ahead of us. Nothing will be awesome. It's all going to have, we have to weigh up the costs.
I read the book For Fish, and I finished it thinking there's probably no way to consume fish without being responsible for some environmental degradation. Is there a way that our consumption of fish can be controlled somehow, that we should be more responsible as consumers?
Well, I think we should be responsible as consumers, and there are a lot of great guides now. I mean, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a seafood guide that you can download to your smartphone, or you can get a little printed out version and put it in your wallet, and it will tell you what species are okay to eat that are being sustainably fished right now. And it's there are things that are being sustainably fished, and so if you eat seafood, it's a good thing to choose that. And you can become even more proactive by, if you buy seafood in your market, you start asking the grocer, where did that come from? And you can slightly begin to educate your grocer and go, Monterey Bay Aquarium says this is not a sustainably fished, could you get something else? So that's a two-way street where we shape the market. It happens a lot where I am now. My local markets now, all in their seafood counters, have printed cards that say where it was fished and the rating of the sustainability of that fishery. So it's starting to happen. Oh, Liz back there.
So with sequestration and budget cuts and the fact that there's so much of the ocean we don't have baseline data on, basic research hasn't yet been established, and scientists are scrambling to assemble funds and steal from this and borrow from that to understand the ecosystem. Where are you seeing really interesting collaborations and conversations between scientific organizations making it happen?
You mean getting the data or?
Getting the data, getting the research done, finding a different model for making the work happen in this more challenging economic time.
Yeah, well, that is a really interesting question because so many of the scientists I know right now are not getting any research funded at all. It's kind of really dried up. And people who are established scientists and have expected to be out on a research cruise every year are not getting it. So I don't know the short-term answer to that, short of Congress doing their job. That would be a nice change. But at any rate, I think what we're learning to do, we used to try to help or manage fisheries by managing a species of fish, and we switched that over to managing ecosystem-based management. And now we're getting into more creative things like catch shares and things where people become partial owners in the stock of a sardine fishery. Now it's in their vested interest to not just, can I get more than my neighbor this year, but will I still have a fishery to fish 10 years from now? So those kinds of questions as we shift our relationship to the ocean are where we're moving towards. And, again, as we learn the problems, we're like massively impatient. We want it done and backwards in time. And why are we so slow? But in fact, if you really honestly look at what we've done in a relatively small amount of time, it's unbelievable in the history of our species. It's phenomenal. So, I choose to recognize that the momentum, although there's a lot of negative, and I report tons of negative every day of my life. That's what I get paid to do. But on the other hand, I know that there's also tons of positive, and that's part of my mission now is to spend more time talking about that stuff.
And the opposite is just as true. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it seems like an anthropocentric presumption that we are responsible.
Yeah. That's part of my sort of growing realization that, we just aren't separate from nature. We are a product of nature. Everything we do, all of our drives are a product of this system that has created this life. We are not outside of it. We are a very, very successful end product of it. So, based on that, if you think of it that way, then you see that, well, what we're doing is we're understanding more. We're realizing things better. We understand how things work increasingly. We see the impact of our actions. This never happened until the last couple of 100 years in a real sense here. So, those are major paradigm-shifting things, and we are wrestling with how do we act with that kind of knowledge. It's a big, big wrestle, and meanwhile, we're getting more and more numerous, and, we've really become the keystone player on the planet. But that doesn't mean we can't make those shifts. So that's our job. That's our job, is how do we do that? That's what we have in front of us. So I'm very intrigued, too, with that notion. I don't feel like I've finished exploring it at all. I feel like it's the beginning of exploration of that idea. But I think it's the real thing. It feels right to me.
Those keystone figures you were talking about, I suspect you're a keystone figure as well. But I do wonder, or evolving keystone figure. And I wonder, have you noticed in looking at their lives, the sort of the trajectory of their lives, were there moments, like how does one evolve into that sort of a person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that with all of those people, I think, honestly, I would say that their keystone place that they are protecting, that they love it like you love a person. It's that important to them. It is what they spend their life on. It's kind of the child that they're pouring energies into. And then if you can imagine that you're protecting or defending your child, there's not much you're gonna stop at, probably. So it's that kind of energy, and this is well known in conservation science, that these odd little people who go park themselves in one place and spend their whole life there are like phenomenally, have a huge impact on saving this place, just this one person. So we all are parked somewhere, We're all parked somewhere, and that's our task, is to be good parents to this place, So they're stubborn, too, all of them. The online title for my Enriqueta Velarde piece is Can One Incredibly Stubborn Person Save a Species? And yes, apparently she can. So... Yes. I think it boils down to what is your calling. I mean, I admire everyone else, like the whole ecosystem of people working on these problems, scientists and activists and artists and everybody in between. I think it's an ecosystem, and it's vital that it has all these elements. And one of the elements is writers. So, that's my calling. I mean, that's the only, I can't do anything else worth a damn, frankly. So, I occasionally go and show up at things and march on things, and but that's not really where I feel like the best use of my tool set. So for me, it's just a very pragmatic answer of what's your best tool set. Go forth and use it. Yeah, really great questions.
Yeah, do you want to sign some books?
Sure, yeah.
All right, well, actually, before we get to that, I'm glad that you brought us back to Isla Rasa, because that is actually a huge part of one of the books that is for sale outside Tipu Home. Pretty much the first 85 pages you spend with Enriqueta and the terns and the gulls there. So if you're at all intrigued about that, go get that book. It's beautifully written. So, we'll have Julia here. You can ask her more questions in line. And we've got 2 of your books outside. But other than that, just another round of applause for our wonderful